The Nazi war machine advanced with astonishing speed, their tanks rolling across the open plains as if nothing could stop them. German commanders were confident, certain that the Soviet defenses were weak, disorganized, and easily broken. Blitzkrieg tactics, perfected in Western Europe, seemed unstoppable, and initial intelligence reports suggested that Soviet forces would crumble under the pressure. Yet what they did not anticipate was the scale and resilience of the Red Army, nor the harsh reality of the Eastern Front's terrain. Thick forests, muddy roads, and sudden stretches of open steppe made coordination difficult, even for the well-trained German units. Soldiers who expected smooth victories now found themselves navigating unfamiliar landscapes, their movements slowed by the unexpected obstacles. Even small Soviet units displayed remarkable tenacity, holding key positions and delaying the German advance longer than anyone had predicted. Reports of resistance began to filter up the command chain, and while some officers dismissed these skirmishes as minor, the cumulative effect was beginning to sow doubt. Supply lines stretched thin, tanks and trucks bogged down in mud, and communication became erratic. German radio operators struggled to maintain contact between advancing columns, creating gaps in coordination. Despite these early successes, unease was growing among the officers, a subtle acknowledgement that the campaign might not be as easy as they had assumed. In the villages and small towns along the way, Soviet civilians often assisted retreating troops, hiding supplies and sending warning messages that added to the chaos. Every hour brought new surprises, an unexpected counterattack, a destroyed bridge, or a defensive trench cleverly concealed in the forest. Harsh weather compounded the challenge. Freezing nights and sudden rains made movement exhausting and visibility poor. German soldiers trained for rapid, decisive engagements were increasingly frustrated by constant skirmishes that drained morale. They had expected to encounter disorganized resistance, but instead found determined adversaries who adapted quickly to every German tactic. Some units reported that Soviet soldiers would disappear into the woods only to reappear along supply lines, ambushing convoys and cutting communication. High-ranking officers began to debate strategy, weighing speed against caution, realizing that pushing forward recklessly could result in disaster. Reports of German tank crews struggling to maneuver across muddy fields circulated quickly, highlighting vulnerabilities in their supposedly superior armor. Logistics officers worked frantically to reroute supplies, yet delays continued to mount. Soldiers whispered of strange, powerful weapons glimpsed in the fog, though details were scarce and often exaggerated. And then, in the distance, obscured by the early morning fog, new forms of resistance began to emerge, silent but threatening, hinting at a force that would soon challenge the invaders in ways they could not yet imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shatter overconfidence and change the course of the campaign forever. The advance of the German army was relentless, yet the Soviet defenders were far from passive. Small, determined units held forests, river crossings, and villages with a discipline that surprised the invaders. The landscape itself became an ally to the defenders. Thick fog often settled over open plains in the early morning, concealing movements and masking the approach of reinforcements. German commanders, accustomed to rapid victories, found themselves navigating terrain that slowed their columns and exposed them to ambushes. Every step forward was met with hidden resistance, trees felled to block roads, trenches dug along unexpected ridges, and barricades set up in narrow passes. The Red Army, despite suffering enormous losses, used these natural advantages to maximize the impact of every soldier and weapon. Orders were issued to delay, harass, and confuse the enemy, turning even minor skirmishes into costly engagements for the Germans. The fog itself became a silent partner in the Soviet strategy, hiding tanks, infantry, and artillery positions until the moment they could strike with deadly precision.
As German tanks pushed through the mist, crews reported sudden explosions, artillery shells that seemed to come from nowhere, and the disorienting sound of distant machine gun fire. Communications broke down, supply lines were threatened, and officers had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. In villages where civilians remained, local knowledge gave Soviet forces the ability to set traps, ambush convoys, and provide crucial intelligence on enemy movements. Reports of isolated German units being cut off, surrounded, or forced to retreat began to filter through the chain of command, creating tension and frustration. The psychological effect of fighting in near-constant fog was profound. Soldiers never knew what might emerge from the mist at any moment. Reinforcements moved quietly through forests, often appearing at the last possible second to strike German flanks. Artillery units camouflaged behind hills and ridges unleashed volleys that disrupted even the most organized attacks. Soldiers reported seeing columns vanish into the mist only to reappear elsewhere, a tactic that sapped morale and created confusion. Supply convoys were ambushed, bridges were destroyed, and reconnaissance patrols reported strange armored shapes in the distance. These early signs hinted at something more formidable than mere infantry, machines that could dominate the battlefield and redefine what the Germans believed possible. The anticipation of encountering these unknown weapons added a growing tension that gnawed at both officers and troops alike. And then, amid the chaos, the first glimpses of armored vehicles began to appear, their shapes obscured but unmistakable. The T-34 tanks, revolutionary in design and unexpected in appearance, promised to shift the balance of power. What the Germans had assumed would be a straightforward advance was turning into a deadly test of adaptability, courage, and endurance. The Soviets were no longer simply defending, they were preparing to strike back in a way that would force the invaders to question every plan and every assumption. The fog, the forests, and the resilient defenders together set the stage for a clash that would define the Eastern Front for months to come.
The morning mist parted just enough to reveal shapes that would change the course of the battle forever. German tank crews and infantry froze as silhouettes appeared on the horizon. Sleek, angular machines moving with a speed and agility they had not anticipated. The T-34 tank, a revolutionary weapon of the Soviet arsenal, was unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered. Its sloped armor made it nearly impervious to the standard German anti-tank weapons, while its wide tracks allowed it to glide across mud and snow where heavier German tanks bogged down. Commanders scrambled to adjust, realizing that their plans for a swift, crushing victory were suddenly obsolete. Soldiers on both sides could hardly believe what they saw. The T-34s appeared from hidden roads, forests, and low hills, striking with a combination of speed and firepower that shattered German formations. Tanks that had seemed unstoppable now faltered under the relentless assault. German officers ordered concentrated fire, but many of their shells simply bounced off the sloped armor. Entire columns were forced to retreat, abandon vehicles, or improvise makeshift defenses under pressure they had never experienced before. The psychological shock was immediate. German crews, trained to dominate the battlefield with precise coordination, now faced an enemy that could appear and disappear almost at will, taking advantage of fog, terrain, and surprise. Meanwhile, the Red Army leveraged the T-34 not only as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool for maneuver warfare. They coordinated infantry, artillery, and tanks in ways that maximized confusion and inflicted maximum damage. Soviet crews, familiar with the terrain and the capabilities of their machines, struck from unexpected angles, forcing the Germans to fight defensively for the first time. Roads and open plains became death traps. Areas that once promised rapid movement were now zones of ambush and destruction.
Reports of German tanks being destroyed by a single shot or of entire flanks collapsing under T-34 assaults began filtering back to high command, who realized that the war on the Eastern Front was entering a new, terrifying phase. By midday, the battlefield had transformed entirely. The T-34s moved with a blend of speed, armor, and firepower that allowed them to punch through German lines, exploit weak points, and vanish into the mist before counterattacks could be organized. Soldiers whispered of these machines like specters, emerging from nowhere to dominate the fight. The confidence that German commanders had carried into the campaign was now replaced with shock and uncertainty. The T-34 was more than a tank. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience, ingenuity, and the beginning of a fight that would stop the invaders in their tracks. Every encounter with these tanks forced a recalculation. Every engagement a brutal lesson in underestimating an enemy that refused to break. The war, once expected to be a swift march, had suddenly become a grueling test of adaptability, courage, and the raw power of a weapon that changed the battlefield.
The appearance of the T-34s sent shockwaves through the German ranks. Units that had advanced confidently just hours earlier now found themselves disoriented, their carefully calculated plans unraveling in real time. Officers shouted orders that were often impossible to execute. Columns became separated, and tanks found themselves isolated in open fields under fire they could not counter. The combination of speed, armor, and unexpected tactics from the Soviets threw entire formations into chaos. Communications broke down as radio channels were overwhelmed with urgent requests for support, reports of ambushes, and frantic pleas for reinforcements that could not arrive in time. German commanders had never experienced an opponent that could strike so effectively and disappear almost instantly. Supply convoys became prime targets, and trucks laden with ammunition and fuel were destroyed or forced to retreat under pressure. Soldiers reported seeing entire flanks collapse without warning as the T-34s exploited gaps in their lines, rolling through positions thought secure. Infantry units attempted to set up defensive positions, but the mobility of the tanks and their ability to attack from unexpected directions made these efforts nearly futile. Panic spread through the ranks as soldiers realized that their previous tactics, rapid advances supported by concentrated firepower, were now counterproductive. The psychological impact was immense. Trained men, confident in their superiority, suddenly faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable, their every move anticipated and punished. Commanders scrambled to adapt. New anti-tank formations were hastily organized, artillery units were repositioned, and coordination between infantry and armor was intensified. Yet every adjustment was met with fresh challenges. The Soviets used terrain to their advantage, hiding their tanks in forests, behind ridges, and within urban ruins, striking only when the Germans were most exposed. Mines, improvised obstacles, and hidden artillery further slowed German movements, forcing officers to rethink every order. Reports of German crews abandoning vehicles under intense fire became increasingly common, highlighting the disarray and mounting fear. Every hour the battlefield became more unpredictable, with previously reliable units faltering under constant pressure. As the day wore on, even experienced German officers admitted privately that they had underestimated the Soviets. The T-34s were not merely weapons, they were symbols of an enemy that had learned, adapted, and now controlled the tempo of the battlefield. Units that had prided themselves on discipline found themselves reacting frantically, improvising defenses, and retreating under fire. Every corner of the battlefield seemed alive with threats, the fog and terrain amplifying the sense of danger. German engineers attempted hurried repairs on disabled tanks, while medics moved desperately between wounded soldiers, all under the constant threat of sudden T-34 strikes.
Morale faltered as the day dragged on, fear creeping into every decision. What had begun as a confident, methodical campaign was now a chaotic struggle for survival. The Germans understood that without rapid adaptation, coordination, and extreme caution, their advance could collapse entirely, and the momentum of the war might shift irreversibly in favor of the Soviets. Every moment of hesitation, every misstep could be exploited, and the battlefield had already proven to be unforgiving to those who underestimated their opponent.
By the time the afternoon sun began to pierce through the lingering fog, the German advance had slowed to a crawl. The Red Army, bolstered by the appearance of T-34 tanks and reinforced infantry units, was no longer simply defending, it was mounting a carefully coordinated counteroffensive. Soviet commanders seized the initiative, striking at exposed flanks and supply lines with precision. German units, once confident in their speed and firepower, now faced ambushes at every turn. Columns of tanks and trucks became prime targets, with T-34s and artillery working in tandem to cut off retreat paths. Each attack was calculated to disrupt, confuse, and demoralize the invaders, forcing them into defensive positions for the first time in the campaign. The battlefield became a chaotic landscape of fire, smoke, and sudden assaults. Infantrymen reported tanks emerging seemingly from nowhere, their crews striking with deadly accuracy before vanishing behind ridges, forests, or urban ruins. Artillery barrages pinned German forces while hidden Soviet infantry closed in, exploiting gaps created by panic and confusion. Engineers rushed to repair bridges, only to see them destroyed again moments later, a constant cycle of destruction that left German officers struggling to maintain control. Communication lines remained fragile, with orders delayed or misunderstood, further magnifying the effect of the Soviet counterattack. Soldiers on both sides were forced into exhausting, high-stakes engagements. The Germans, previously used to dictating the pace of the fight, now reacted constantly, trying to anticipate moves they could not see. Meanwhile, Soviet forces used the terrain, fog, and knowledge of local roads to their advantage, launching attacks that forced German units to retreat repeatedly. Supply shortages compounded the Germans' difficulties, leaving frontline units vulnerable and isolated. Reports of entire battalions being cut off or forced to surrender began to circulate, spreading unease through the ranks. The psychological impact was immense. Confidence turned into fear, and hesitation became deadly. As darkness fell, the Soviets consolidated their gains, pushing forward with relentless pressure. Every river crossing, ridge, and village became contested, and German commanders were forced to acknowledge that their initial assumptions of rapid conquest were hopelessly flawed. Coordinated T-34 assaults, combined with infantry and artillery, had not only stopped the German advance, they had reversed it in critical sectors. Soldiers recounted seeing entire columns retreating under constant fire, while supply lines crumbled behind them. The Germans realized that the Red Army had regained the strategic initiative, turning what had been expected to be a quick victory into a grueling test of endurance and adaptability. By nightfall, it was clear the momentum had shifted decisively, and the Soviets had demonstrated that even the most powerful invasion could be halted and turned back with courage, coordination, and innovation. In the chilling night air, the sounds of battle still echoed across the plains, explosions, gunfire, and the distant roar of T-34 engines signaling that the Red Army was not finished. Soldiers who had survived the day spoke in hushed tones about the resilience and ingenuity of their opponents, understanding that the fight was far from over, but that they had already witnessed a turning point. German units, exhausted and demoralized, huddled in makeshift defensive positions, calculating the next desperate moves while the Soviets prepared to press their advantage at dawn. The Eastern Front had shifted irreversibly. The Germans had learned a harsh truth. Underestimating the Soviets was a mistake that could not be undone.
Every success, every advance, now carried a warning. Here, on this frozen, fog-shrouded battlefield, the momentum had changed, and the Soviets held the power to dictate the pace, the strategy, and the fate of those who dared invade.